Alexander Grant was a man who moved through the world like a shark gliding through deep, dark water, silent, lethal, and utterly untouchable. He had built an empire of steel and glass that scraped the clouds of New York City, his name etched in gold letters on buildings that housed the fates of thousands. He was a billionaire, a title that acted as armor against the inconveniences of ordinary life. He did not wait in lines. He did not check price tags. He did not hear the word no. But today was an anomaly, a rare glitch in the perfectly curated algorithm of his existence. His driver had been delayed by a massive pileup on the interstate, and a sudden, inexplicable thirst had driven Alexander into a rundown, fluorescent-lit supermarket on the edge of town. He stood there now, clad in a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than the cashier's annual salary, holding a bottle of sparkling water and a bag of imported coffee beans. The contrast was jarring. He looked like a diamond dropped into a bin of coal, and the air around him crackled with the silent judgment of the tired, overworked people standing in the queue behind him. Before we dive into this powerful story of humiliation and unexpected grace, if you believe that kindness can appear in the darkest moments, please hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us share stories that touch the soul. Join our family today, and let's make the world a little brighter. Now, let's witness the moment Alexander's world fell apart. The line moved with agonizing slowness, a torture Alexander was not accustomed to enduring. The air in the store was thick with the smell of floor wax and stale popcorn, a sensory assault that made his nose wrinkle in distaste. Behind him, a mother scolded a crying toddler, the sound piercing his ears like a needle, while a man in oil-stained coveralls tapped his foot impatiently, the rhythm vibrating through the linoleum floor. Alexander checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, and sighed audibly. He was a man whose time was valued at thousands of dollars a minute, yet here he was, trapped in the purgatory of a suburban grocery store. He felt the eyes of the other shoppers on him, heavy with a mixture of envy and resentment. They saw the cut of his suit, the shine of his shoes, the way he held himself with an effortless, arrogant posture. To them, he was an alien, an intruder from a world they only saw on television screens. Alexander ignored them, keeping his gaze fixed on the exit, mentally drafting an email to his assistant about firing the driver. He had no idea that in less than 60 seconds, his arrogance would be stripped away, layer by painful layer, leaving him more naked than he had ever been in his life. When he finally reached the register, the cashier, a woman named Brenda with frizzy hair and a name tag hanging crookedly on her smock, didn't even look up. She smacked gum loudly, scanning his items with a lethargic indifference that bordered on insolence. "$22.50, she mumbled, extending a hand without making eye contact. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his sleek, heavy black card. It was made of titanium, cool to the touch, a symbol of limitless access and infinite power. He handed it to her with a flick of his wrist, already turning his body toward the door, ready to leave this mundane nightmare behind. Brenda swiped the card. A beat of silence followed. Then a harsh, buzzing sound erupted from the machine. "Declined," she said flatly, looking at the screen. Alexander froze. He turned back slowly, a frown creasing his forehead. "Try it again," he commanded, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "It's the machine. That card has no limit." Brenda rolled her eyes, a gesture so disrespectful it made Alexander's blood boil. She swiped it again, harder this time. "Buzz." "Still declined." "Honey," she said, her voice raising an octave so the people in line could hear. "You got cash? Or maybe a card that actually works?" The atmosphere in the store shifted instantly. The low hum of chatter died out, replaced by a suffocating silence that centered entirely on Alexander. The man behind him chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Looks like the fancy suit is just a rental," someone whispered loudly. Alexander felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a poor boy in the Bronx 50 years ago. He pulled out his wallet, his fingers fumbling slightly, a crack in his composure. He tried a second card. "Buzz." "Declined." He tried a third. Buzz. Declined. It wasn't possible. He was Alexander Grant. He could buy this entire chain of supermarkets with a phone call. But the banking system didn't care about his reputation. A security freeze, likely triggered by this unusual, small purchase in a strange town, had locked him out of his own fortune. The irony was devastating. He stood there, surrounded by millions of dollars of potential credit, yet he was functionally bankrupt in the eyes of a checkout machine. The silence in the store began to fracture, replaced by the sharp, stinging sound of laughter. It started with Brenda, a cruel, cackling laugh that exposed her yellowed teeth, and soon it spread to the line behind him. Alexander stood paralyzed, his hand hovering over the useless plastic rectangles scattered on the conveyor belt. The humiliation was absolute. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a total deconstruction of his identity. Without his money, without the ability to transact, who was he? Just an old man in a suit, standing in the way of people who had real work to do. "Move it along, rich boy," the man in coveralls shouted, stepping forward aggressively. "Some of us got places to be." Brenda leaned over the counter, her face twisted in a smirk. "You want me to put this back? Or are you going to call your mommy to pay for your fancy water?" The laughter grew louder, a chorus of mockery that echoed off the high ceilings. Alexander Grant, the titan of industry, felt his knees weaken. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the people he had spent his life looking down upon. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached, fighting back the urge to scream, to explain, to threaten. But he knew it was useless. In this moment, in this aisle, he was nobody. And then, through the haze of his shame, he felt a small, gentle tug on his sleeve. He looked down, expecting to see a security guard or an angry manager. Instead, he saw a pair of wide, brown eyes looking up at him with profound concern. It was a little girl, no older than 7, wearing a faded purple shirt and clutching a handful of coins as if they were the crown jewels. The laughter in the store had morphed into something predatory, a collective release of frustration directed at the man who represented everything these shoppers resented. They saw his failure not as a mistake, but as justice. Alexander Grant stood in the center of the storm, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt stripped, exposed, like a king dragged from his throne and thrown into the mud. He grabbed his wallet, his hands trembling with a rage that was slowly turning into despair, ready to leave the items and storm out into the cold. He would walk miles if he had to. Anything was better than this suffocating mockery. Brenda, the cashier, was reveling in the moment, holding up the bottle of sparkling water like a trophy. "Guess the water was too sparkling for his bank account," she shouted, eliciting another round of guffaws from the back of the line. The sound was sharp, ugly, and devoid of humanity. It was the sound of a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Alexander closed his eyes for a second, wishing he could disappear, wishing he could dissolve into the floor tiles. It was in that precise second of absolute darkness that the tug on his sleeve came again, firmer this time. Alexander looked down. The little girl was small, fragile-looking, with braids that were fraying at the ends and sneakers that had been scrubbed clean but were clearly secondhand. She didn't look at the angry crowd. She didn't look at the cruel cashier. Her entire world was focused on Alexander's face. She didn't see a billionaire who had lost his power. She saw a grandfather, a father, a human being who was hurting. The innocence in her gaze was disarming, piercing through the layers of Alexander's defense mechanisms. The store seemed to blur around the edges, the jeering faces fading into the background as the girl stepped forward. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her worn jeans, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were performing a sacred ritual. Her hand emerged as a small, tight fist. She unclenched her fingers, revealing a collection of warm, sweaty currency. 3 crumpled dollar bills, smoothed out with care, and a pile of silver and copper coins. The noise in the store began to die down, not all at once, but in waves, as people noticed the small figure standing between the giant man and the counter. The laughter caught in throats. The pointing fingers lowered. A heavy, Confused silence descended, different from the earlier tension. This was the silence of shame. The little girl stood on her tiptoes, straining to reach the height of the counter. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of giving away everything she had. "Here," she whispered, her voice soft but cutting through the quiet like a bell. "I can help." She placed the money on the black rubber belt next to Alexander's declined card. The coins clinked, a tiny, metallic sound that echoed louder than the shouting had. "It's all I have," she added, looking at Brenda with a defiance that belied her age. "But maybe it's enough for the water." Alexander stared at the pile of money. It couldn't have been more than $5. To him, $5 was nothing, a rounding error, a tip left on a table without a second thought. But looking at her clothes, looking at the way she looked at those coins, he realized with a jolt that felt like a physical blow. This was her treasure. Alexander felt a cracking sensation in his chest. For 40 years, he had measured value in stock options, real estate portfolios, and quarterly returns. He had sat in boardrooms and destroyed competitors without blinking. He had fired thousands of people to save percentages on a spreadsheet. His heart had become a stone, polished and hard. But now, watching this child offer her life savings to a stranger who had been nothing but arrogant, the stone shattered. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked his eyes. He tried to blink them away, terrified of showing weakness, but they spilled over, tracking hot paths down his cheeks. He fell to his knees, not in defeat, but to bring himself to her level. The expensive suit fabric pressed into the dirty linoleum, but he didn't care. "Why?" he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." The girl shrugged, a simple, unburned motion. "My mommy says that when someone is sad, we have to fix it," she said simply. "And you looked really sad." The simplicity of her logic was devastating. The store was now dead silent. Brenda's face had lost its smirk. Her mouth hung open slightly, her eyes darting around, as if looking for an exit from her own cruelty. The man in coveralls who had shouted earlier cleared his throat awkwardly and looked at his boots. The woman with the crying toddler quieted her child, watching the scene with a hand over her mouth. The energy in the room had shifted from a mob mentality to a collective introspection. They had all seen a rich man fail and enjoyed it. But this child had seen a human being in pain and acted. She had held up a mirror to the entire room, and the reflection was ugly for everyone except her. Alexander reached out and gently closed the girl's hand over her money. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I cannot take this. You are too good." He looked up at Brenda, his eyes now blazing not with anger, but with a terrifying clarity. "Cancel the order," he said softly. Then he looked back at the girl. "What is your name?" She smiled, missing a front tooth. "Lily," she said. "I'm Lily." Alexander nodded, wiping his face with a silk handkerchief. "Lily," he repeated, tasting the name like a prayer. "You had just saved me, and you don't even know it." Alexander Grant walked out of the supermarket, not with groceries, but with a hand firmly holding the small, sticky hand of a 7-year-old girl named Lily. He had left his black card on the counter, a piece of plastic that meant nothing compared to what he had just found. The crowd had parted for them as they left, heads bowed in silent apology, the air thick with regret. Brenda had tried to stammer an apology, but Alexander hadn't even heard her. His entire universe had narrowed down to the child walking beside him. "Where is your mother, Lily?" he asked gently, his voice still rough from the tears he had shed. "She's at work," Lily chirped, skipping slightly to match his stride. "But she comes home for lunch break now. I live right there." She pointed a small finger toward a row of dilapidated houses down the street, structures with peeling paint and sagging porches that seemed to lean against each other for support. Alexander looked at the neighborhood, a place he would have normally ordered demolished to make way for a parking lot, and saw it for the first time as a home. They arrived at a small blue house where the porch steps groaned under Alexander's weight. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman in a faded waitress uniform, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes bright with love. "Lily," she exclaimed, dropping to her knees to hug the girl. "I told you not to wander too far." She looked up then, her eyes widening as she took in the towering figure of Alexander in his dusty, tear-stained Italian suit. Fear flashed across her face, the instinctive fear of the poor when facing the rich. "Is everything okay? Did she bother you, sir?" Alexander shook his head quickly, raising a hand in peace. "No, madam," he said, his voice humble. "Your daughter, she didn't bother me. She rescued me." He spent the next hour sitting in their cramped kitchen, drinking tap water from a chipped mug. He listened as Sarah, Lily's mother, talked about her double shifts, the medical bills for her late husband, and the struggle to keep the lights on. She spoke without self-pity, just stating the hard facts of survival. Alexander listened, really listened for the first time in decades. He looked at Lily, coloring in a book in the corner, and realized that the $3 she had offered him was likely her lunch money for the week. That night, Alexander sat in his penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The silence of his apartment usually felt like power. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's hand extending those crumpled bills. He looked at his bank accounts on his tablet. Numbers with 9 zeros, assets, liquidity. It all looked like meaningless code. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, building walls to keep people out, thinking that security came from gold. But in that grocery store, stripped of his armor, he had been a pauper. And Lily, with nothing in her pockets, had been the queen. She possessed a wealth he had never touched, the wealth of the spirit. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been poor his whole life. He stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and pressed his hand against the glass. Never again, he whispered to the city below. Never again. The next morning, the change began. It wasn't a press release. It was an avalanche. Alexander Grant, the Iron Wolf of Wall Street, announced the liquidation of a massive portion of his private assets. He didn't just write a check. He went to war against poverty. He returned to the small town, not with lawyers, but with contractors. He bought the supermarket and fired Brenda. But then he hired her back on the condition she attend empathy training, giving her a second chance he knew he didn't deserve, but had received anyway. He paid off the mortgage of every house on Lily Street. He set up a trust fund for Lily that would ensure she could go to any university in the world, and he endowed a foundation in her name dedicated to emergency aid for families in crisis. But he didn't stop at money. The tabloids began to snap photos of Alexander, not on yachts, but in soup kitchens, ladling broth next to volunteers. They saw him sitting in community centers, listening to single mothers, taking notes with the same intensity he used to reserve for mergers. Years passed, and the legend of Alexander Grant changed. The skyscrapers still bore his name, but people stopped looking up at the steel. Instead, they looked at the man. He became a fixture in Lily's life, an honorary grandfather who sat in the front row of her school plays and cheered the loudest. When he eventually passed away, decades later, his funeral was not filled with bankers and politicians. It was filled with thousands of ordinary people, people whose groceries he had paid for, whose homes he had saved, whose dignity he had restored. In the front row sat Lily, now a grown woman, holding the hand of her own daughter. She walked to the podium, not with a prepared speech, but with a small, framed object. She held it up for the crowd to see. It was 3 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of coins, preserved behind glass. "He told me once," Lily said, her voice breaking, "that this was the biggest investment anyone ever made in him. He said it bought him his soul back." Alexander Grant had died a billionaire, but his true legacy wasn't the money he left behind. It was the love he left in the hearts of strangers. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that the smallest candle can light the darkest room, please subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone you love, and let's keep spreading kindness together. You never know whose life you might change with a single act of compassion.